I'm Hannah.
I'm Suruti.
And welcome to a very clean episode of RedHanded. We've got some murders for you, we've got some axe swinging for you, but most of all, we've got quite a lot of soap this episode.
I mean, so much. Maybe we could get a soap deal now. Maybe we could start our own brand of soap. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's wait until these episodes are over and then see. This episode is all about protective soap in a dark, magic-y kind of way, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I would advise that towards the end of the episode, you don't eat anything because it does get pretty graphic. So get all your munching out the way now. Unless you're a pervert, in which case just order a pizza now and it'll be here just in time for the bit.
We're not going to stop you and we're not going to judge, but we are going to warn you.
I'm judging. I definitely am. This week we've got a female serial killer. The spookiest bitch of all, Leonarda Cianciulli. And she was nicknamed the soap maker of Correggio. And this is so spooky, so fucked up, so full of fortune-telling and axe-swinging murder that we have made it into 2 whole parts so you can get every drop of information out there on this case. Because I think this one is quite well known, but the details of it are not. And that is what these 2 parts will be all about for you.
Absolutely. We did like a recent post on social being like, what episodes do you guys want to see us cover in a really in-depth 2-parter? And this one got so many requests. Like, I was really surprised. So we're doing it. And a lot of the other shows that are out there, documentaries, etc., on this case, they don't really get into the nitty-gritty, soapy weeds of it. So that's what we're going to do. So get ready.
Yeah, this is not trickle-down soap economics. This is soap, another analogy for the opposite of trickle-down soap economics.
Nailed it.
Well done. Me moving on. Leonardo was born in 1894 in the olden daysels in Montella in Avellino, which is in the south of Italy. Her birth was not a happy occasion for her mother, Amelia Denolfi. It had been a very difficult time for Amelia. She had conceived this baby after she'd been raped. Amelia was quite the catch in the Pasto town of Montella. She was beautiful, she had a good reputation and a rich family, so needless to say, she had a promising future ahead of her with her choice of suitors. She was just approaching the age of marriage when she caught the eye of a man called Mariano Cianciulli who lived in the same town as her, but not by any stretch of the imagination in the same world. Mariano didn't have much going for him at the time. He had no money. He came from a long line of alcoholics. It was unlikely that he and Amelia would ever cross paths. There was no overlap between their social circles. But Avellino was not a large place.
Mariano had seen Amelia around town, and it didn't take long for him to develop an obsession with her. But the differences between their social standings was not lost on him, and he despised her for it. He's kind of like the Pasto incel. He's like the OG incel.
Yep.
He's like, I want her. She'll never look at me. I fucking hate her.
Yeah.
Etc. So Mariano dreamt of taking Amelia down from her pedestal. And one night, he saw his opportunity. Amelia had been at a fancy chaperone dinner party with one of her suitors. All the while, Mariano had been lingering in the shadows outside of the estate, drinking a bottle of cheap wine, laying in wait. Have you seen the movie Perfume? Because that's what I feel he's like.
I have a sneaking suspicion that this case inspired Perfume a bit. I think I've read that somewhere.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
That does make sense now that I think about it. But that's the vibe that I'm getting. He's like standing outside of this estate, being a creeper.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond that because it was a summer night that night. And Amelia wasn't that far from home. So at the end of the evening, she decided that she'd just walk back alone. So she waved goodbye to her dinner hosts at the gate and started to walk back. Almost immediately, however, Mariano pounced on Amelia from behind and dragged her off the road into a neighbouring field. To begin with, Amelia thought that it was just one of her friends simply playing a trick on her. But as the man began trying to take her skirt off, she knew that something was terribly wrong. And although she knew that something was wrong, this bit is so sad. Amelia was so innocent and naive and had grown up in such a sheltered way that she didn't know what Mariano actually wanted. She thought that he was trying to rob her, even as he began pulling her underwear down. Amelia's parents had never talked to her about sex. She didn't know what was going on. That night in that field, in the pitch black, Mariano raped Amelia. She cried and screamed in pain, but he covered her mouth. After it was over, Mariano simply left Amelia there and went home. Amelia lay there for hours until she finally found the strength to pick herself up and go home. Every step she took was agony.
The following morning, when she woke up, Amelia convinced herself that the horrific incident from the night before was just a nightmare. That was until she found that her thighs were crusted with dried blood and her dress was covered in mud. Still, she didn't know exactly what had happened. But that good old Catholic shame kicked right in, and she knew what had happened was something to do with sex. So it's Lent right now, and I remembered what gets said in Catholic churches when Lent happens. Do you want to know?
Oh my God, yes.
So Lent is obviously, in its truest form, I suppose, the most orthodox people go vegan for Lent and there's no sex, right, for the whole thing. And what they say in church is, "For thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return."
Ooh, put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, chilling. And I, as a child, was just like, you don't process it at all, do you?
Oh my God.
And also, dust in Philip Pullman's things is original sin. Philip, I love you.
So many dots just aligning before my eyes. Fucking dusty Catholic connections. Dusty Catholic dots.
Just a dusty Catholic. Oh my goodness. Right. So, yes, we're all dust. You probably don't need reminding of this, but in the Catholic Church, sex is not fine ever at all unless you're married or a priest into little boys. So Amelia, understanding that something to do with sex had happened to her, felt dirty and sinful in the eyes of the Lord. She couldn't bear the idea of anybody finding out. So quickly, Amelia cleaned herself and the dress before her parents could find out. For months, she went on as if nothing had happened, pushing the memory to the back of her mind the best she could. Her parents didn't notice that anything was wrong with their perfect daughter's behaviour. They didn't notice her sadness either. But there were other signs beginning to appear that were harder to hide, the most conspicuous being a bump in Amelia's stomach beginning to grow slowly. Amelia's mother finally noticed and her parents confronted Amelia. But when she refused to answer their questions, they threatened to go from house to house, asking each of her suitors until they found the culprit. And so eventually Amelia broke and told them everything about who had raped her and the night that it had happened.
The following evening, a horrified Amelia found herself sat around her family's dining table with her parents, and sat across from them was her rapist and his family. Her parents spoke with Mariano's about how the boy would need to, quote, make things right. And the only way to maintain their daughter's honor was for Mariano to marry her immediately. Needless to say, Mariano was thrilled about this news. And of course, Amelia was distraught. A date was set for the wedding, and after the hasty ceremony was over with, the newlywed couple walked in silence, carrying their bags to their new home. The two had barely spoken any words to each other since the rape, not even at their own wedding. Their home wasn't a grand estate like Amelia was accustomed to, and nor was it a modest townhouse like Mariano was accustomed to. It was a tiny shanty in the poorest part of town. The first few days were traumatic for Amelia. Her happy life and everything she'd ever known was gone. On their wedding night, when it became obvious to Mariano that Amelia didn't want anything to do with him, he raped her again and again. Amelia's life with Mariano was a miserable one. He'd beat her when she didn't keep the house as tidy as he wanted, and he'd beat her when she failed to cook dinner the way he liked it. And of course, the rape and the abuse was constant. And remember that all the while, Amelia was also pregnant.
The only people in her life that Amelia thought would always protect her turned their backs on her. Even her mother treated her with contempt, saying that if she didn't want this life with Mariano, then she shouldn't have given up her purity to him. Like, how dumb is it that, as a global society, we decided that penises are so important that they physically change the worth of women?
That's so interesting. And you're right. And it's like when, I think we talked about this in the Nirabaya case, the Delhi rape case that we covered, that horrible man, that horrible lawyer says something like, oh, well, men are like glass. If you drop them in mud, you can just wipe it clean. But a woman is like silk. If you drop her in mud, you'll never get her clean again. That's that mentality. And, you know, obviously we're all looking at this as a Pasto case and we're like, oh, how horrific. This kind of thing still fucking happens all the bloody time. Like, he raped you. Oh, you're his now. You have to marry him. That's just what has to happen.
Also, I watched The Serpent on your recommendation on what is it, BBC One. It's so good. It's so good, firstly. And secondly, I was watching it with my mum, and she pointed something out which I hadn't realised, is that if you're a wife, you used to be on your husband's passport. You didn't have your own.
Oh my God.
And like, it's crazy to me that my mum, who's in her 60s, right, like seems like a pretty modern person to me, but was very much alive in a time where women didn't have their own passports if they were married.
Wow.
It is so much more knocking at the door than we think it is.
Oh, of course.
Sorry, Mum, that I told everyone you're in your 60s. She's 42. But for Amelia, as awful as things were, I'm afraid worse was yet to come. One hot April night, Mariano was out drinking with his friends and Amelia went into labour all alone in the house. She managed to run into the street and beg and plead with every passerby until finally one of the neighbouring women decided to take pity on her and had someone run to get the town's midwife. The labour was long and painful, and Amelia fell in and out of consciousness until, finally, Leonarda Soap Queen Cianciulli was born. It would have been nice if this baby had brought some much-needed light into Amelia's now tragic life, but all she could see when she looked at the crying baby's face was her downfall and all of the pain Mariano had caused her.
In the years that followed, Amelia, Mariano, and Leonardo moved from place to place. They never managed to hold down one house for long, because Mariano would rather spend what little money they had drinking and gambling, rather than paying for rent or food for his wife and child. Leonardo later in life didn't remember too much about these early days, and actually could barely even remember her father, but she could remember her mother, and these weren't happy memories, to say the least. Amelia had lost any control she'd ever had over her life the day that Mariano had raped her, and her pregnancy, from that rape, meant that she had lost control over her body too. Now stuck in this loveless, violent marriage, the only thing she could exert any control over was her child, Leonardo, and this is exactly what she did.
She took out all of her frustrations and misery on Leonardo as a toddler. She beat her for the slightest disobedience, cursed her for every imperfection, and by day, Amelia poured hatred onto Leonardo. By night, she suffered violence at the hands of her drunken husband. One night, 3 years into their marriage, Mariano stopped coming home. It took over a week for Amelia to even notice that something was wrong. After all, it wasn't unusual for him to go on long benders. When Amelia did eventually go looking for him, she found Mariano at a friend's place, where he had fallen into a comatose state after catching a bad fever. Amelia brought him home, but it wasn't so that she could nurse him back to health. She simply let him lie there, on the bed, creeping slowly towards death. Amelia began to think about how good her life would be as a widow, and how this would be her chance at a new beginning. At the funeral, Amelia played the part of a sad widow, as young Leonardo waited by her father's grave. But when all the attendees had paid their respects and left, Amelia knelt down on Mariano's grave and spat at the tombstone, telling her daughter, "That man was a pig, and it's for the best we're rid of him."
Can't really disagree at that point. I'm like, yep, maybe now everything will be okay.
No, but I do think that spitting on a gravestone is so beautifully Italian. Like what a passionate thing to do.
I know, isn't it just? Just imagine her in like black lace covering her face, just lifting it up a bit to spit at the tombstone.
With one of those like lace umbrellas.
Wonderful.
And like a veil that she lifts just to spit.
I love it. Love it. But if you, like I, hoped that this would be a turning point for Amelia, as was a pattern in her life, her hopes and plans were not to be. She was under the impression that now that her husband was dead, her family would welcome her home with open arms. But it turned out that the last thing they wanted was to invite their shameful daughter back under their roof. So Amelia was on her own. She did, however, eventually find a new husband who had a little bit more money than Mariano had, and the pair spent their days out drinking and dancing every night, while Leonardo was pretty much left to look after herself. The only times that Amelia paid any attention to her daughter was when she was beating or berating Leonardo. Life was miserable for the young girl, was full of darkness and anxiety, and it didn't take long for all the abuse to take its toll. And she was just a teenager the first time she attempted suicide.
Leonardo made a noose for herself from an old bedsheet, but her knot tying wasn't quite up to scratch, and the noose came undone before she died. She couldn't speak for an entire week after this attempt to kill herself because she'd crushed her larynx, but her mum didn't even notice. Just less than a year at the age of 13, Leonardo attempted suicide again in the same way, but once again it didn't work. She took this as a sign that maybe the universe had other plans for her. So she decided to live and find out what those plans might be.
And this is the kind of beginning we see of Leonardo's sort of magical thinking. A pattern of thinking that we're going to explore in great detail for the rest of the episode and next week. But it does feel like this survival of her second suicide attempt maybe sparks off that kind of feeling that she has a bigger role to play in life and in the universe than just being this downtrodden child.
I think I cannot remember the name of the organisation's name, but there's a suicide prevention charity. And to raise money, they sell these, I think they're necklaces or rings that are semicolons, because you use a semicolon when you could have ended a sentence but chose not to. Isn't that amazing?
I love that. It's like my two favourite things, jewellery and punctuation. I love that.
As Leonardo grew into her late teens, she started to look more and more like her mother. Her looks didn't go unnoticed by Amelia. Amelia saw her daughter's newfound beauty as an opportunity, perhaps to marry her off to someone rich who would bankroll her and then lift her back into the upper echelons of society. So Amelia set about secretly meeting with potential suitors. But Leonardo, who was now 21, had already been dating a man in secret for years. And when Amelia found this out, she was livid.
This man who had been secretly dating Leonardo was named Raphael Pancardi. He was 7 years older than Leonardo and held a low-paying clerk job, but it was stable, and stability was something Leonardo yearned for in life. The wedding was a small ceremony with just Raphael's family and a few friends, and of course Leonardo's mother Amelia didn't attend. After the wedding, Leonardo went home to collect her belongings, and Amelia was waiting for her. She screamed at her daughter and put a curse on her marriage. Leonardo was devastated. And this becomes another key turning point in Leonardo's life. Like many people at the time, she was extremely superstitious, and her mum's curse on her new marriage stuck in her mind. And as you will see, it becomes something that goes on to plague her life forever. So deep was her fear about what her mother had said that Leonardo avoided even looking Amelia in the eye from that day on. And it didn't help that the first few years of her marriage to Raphael were filled with misfortune. The years of ridicule and abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her mother had scarred Leonardo, and her behaviour in her marriage was beginning to show it. Now, Raphael, by all accounts, was a kind and understanding man, but he often found himself confused as to why Leonardo would break down in tears when she burnt his dinner, or would cower in the corner when she failed to remove a stain from his clothing. And rather than ease with time, Leonardo's nervous disposition and anxiety grew worse and worse.
Soon, she began having fits and seizures whenever she became nervous. It was like she had epilepsy, but Leonardo never went to the doctors, as she was convinced that it was all down to her mother's curse. She even believed that the curse was why Raphael was struggling at work, and why he was constantly overlooked for promotions. And so Leonardo decided that enough was enough. She decided she needed help. But it wouldn't come from a doctor or even a priest. She needed to get her fortune told by the Romani travellers, who were often passed through her town. Leonardo had always feared the travelling Romani people, due to her mother's racist horror stories, even though she had Romani blood from her father's side. Leonardo was desperate, so she begged the Romani travellers for help. And reluctantly, the palm reader ushered Leonardo into her tent. And before they even sat down, Leonardo yelled, "Am I going to die? Is that what the curse is going to do?" Which, if you go to a fortune teller, do not say anything. That's the whole point.
Don't do it. I mean, it is quite the giveaway for this cold read that this woman is going to do on you. It's not quite a cold read anymore. It's like a fucking inferno read. Yeah, don't say that to anyone ever.
And the palm reader looked at Leonardo's hand in response to this question and traced the lifelines on her palms with her finger and then said, "No, you're not going to die. Not for a very long time." Relief washed over Leonardo. But then the palm reader continued, "You're going to live a long life full of sadness, and you're going to outlive every one of your children." The relief disappeared as quickly as it had come, and Leonardo threw a coin to the fortune teller before running home. Finally, she knew. This was her mother's curse at work.
These fortune tellers, man, sounds very familiar to a little fortune heard by Cersei Lannister, does it not?
Yeah. And also, Jesus's mum. She was told in La Bible by someone called Hannah, actually, that a sword of 7 sorrows would pierce her heart. And Jesus had 7 wounds.
Oh, that sounds horrible. No wonder you'd be scared.
Is it 7?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, hands, feet, that's 4, side, head, something else. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah, sword of 7 sorrows.
Shit, man. Hannah, I think you're destined for this. Guys, I don't know if you all know, but Hannah is now a tarot card reader extraordinaire. And I really want to use her newfound skills over on Patreon. Who wants your cards read by Hannah, virtually speaking?
I'm not very good. It's hard because there's 78 cards, right? They all have at least 2 meanings, and in different combinations, they mean different things. So there's like literally millions of combinations that all have potentially different meanings. And obviously, it's all down to my interpretation. But I've had a few situations where I think I'm too empathetic to do it because, like, my friends or whatever, they've asked me to do it and something bad happens and then I don't tell them because I'm too scared.
Oh, no. Did it tell you that their heart was going to be pierced with 7 swords of sorrow? And then you're like, no, you're going to be fine. Don't worry. Carry on.
Well, kind of. One of my friends asked if they were going to be successful in a particular business endeavor, and the card said, no, they're deluded and something really bad's going to happen that's going to be out of their control. And I just said it would all be fine. Whoops.
Is that not against the ethics of card reading? I don't know.
That's why I only do it for myself now.
So if somebody wants to get your cards read, let us know. Is that a good thing? Is that a good idea? Would you like that? We'll get Hannah to not lie to you. Or maybe you want to be lied to. I don't know. Tell us on social. We'll find out.
And also, like, you can't be annoyed if I have to look up the meaning. Like, I don't know them all. There's too many.
And I do realise I am just, like, pimping Hannah out on this. So if anybody can think of any, like, skills that I have that I can provide in this, like, future apocalyptic barter society we're probably going to enter via Patreon, let me know and I can also do that. Fair's fair.
As long as you're completely prepared for the fact that I'm not very good at it.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what I'm doing. Come on down.
Don't worry about it. Anyway, right, back to Leonardo. So Leonardo had just heard this rather horrible prophecy from this palm reader, and it was really sad because Leonardo and Raphael desperately wanted children. And despite the fortune teller's words ringing in her ears, Leonardo tried. It took 3 years for her to finally become pregnant, and as the life inside her grew, she decided that she would do anything and everything she possibly could to protect and keep it safe. This increased her anxiety even more, and with this, her seizures became worse and more frequent, which of course led to more falls. Within 3 months of getting pregnant, Leonardo miscarried, and in 1920, Leonardo and her husband Raphael packed up their belongings and boarded a train to leave Montella forever. I guess they're like, we just need to get away from my mum. We need to get away from all this bad fucking energy in this place. Let's go somewhere else and start again. So in 1921, they settled down in Raphael's hometown in Lauria Potenza. They had saved enough money by this point to even put down a deposit on a small house. So now, 100 miles away from her mother, in the warmer climate of southern Italy, Leonardo's health began to improve, and the seizures even became less and less frequent. Leonardo even began to believe that maybe her mother's curse wasn't real after all. So, they began trying to get pregnant again. And in 1922, their first son, Giuseppe, was born. And he was the perfect, healthy little boy that Leonardo had always wanted. And unlike Amelia, Leonardo was a devoted mother. She spent every waking moment focused on her son and his well-being. She wanted nothing more than for him to have a secure and happier life than she had ever had.
Money was the only issue. Leonardo applied for every job she could find, but nobody wanted to hire her. She could only find, quote-unquote, woman's work like bar work or cleaning, but Leonardo persevered. Over the years, Leonardo conceived again multiple times, but many of these pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Eventually, she did give birth to 2 girls in quick succession and then another boy soon after, and this made her feel like she was beating the curse. But slowly, the children began to sicken. The girls began coughing constantly, and the youngest boy was covered in rashes. The 2 little girls passed away, and the youngest son soon followed. This grief meant that Leonarda's mental state deteriorated even more. She pulled chunks of her own hair out from the stress. She started to become more and more paranoid about her 2 remaining children, and it got to the point that she refused to even let Giuseppe out of her sight. Over the years, Leonardo and Raphael had more children, but none of them survived past the age of 3. A total of 5 little boys died, and Leonardo's sanity was at tipping point. Raphael recognized that his wife's obsession with their children's health was becoming dangerous. To Leonardo, every whimper her babies made was potentially a fatal issue. Even when they slept silently, they would be awoken by Leonardo shaking them to check that they were alive. Which, to be honest, if I'd had that many children die, I would probably be like that too.
Oh, yeah. Because my mum was only 18, 19 when I was born. And she said that she would just stare at me while I was asleep. And she would constantly put her hand under my nose just to check that I was still breathing. Because, yeah, the anxiety of like any quote unquote normal mother must be through the fucking roof when you bring a newborn home, especially if you have multiple miscarriages and multiple like infant deaths. But I think with Leonardo, the more we sort of delve into the case, the more doesn't it remind you of Andrea Yates, but just the opposite outcome.
Yeah, true.
And I do wonder, obviously this is happening in the 1920s. Andrea happened in the 2000s and she still got none of the help she needed. It does sound a lot like Leonardo's abuse did obviously culminate in her having a lot of issues, but that possibly she was suffering with some sort of postpartum psychosis. So Raphael, thinking that Leonardo just needed something to distract herself, she needed something else in her life. So he decided to find her work, and he actually managed to get her a job as a cleaner at the local bank, where she would clean in the evenings after all the clerks had gone home. The peace and quiet of the empty place suited Leonardo well, but the bank didn't provide her with the proper cleaning supplies that she needed. And Leonardo found herself having to experiment overnight by mixing together various chemicals and solutions to try and create soaps just to do her job. She even became quite good at it, but the satisfaction went away when she got her paycheck. It was just enough to survive on, but not enough to save anything for her children's futures. Leonardo's mind by this point was on the brink, and all it needed was one last nudge to push her over the edge. And this final nudge came one day when she was at work and her 10th child died at home. Nobody even came to tell Leonardo what had happened. She only found out when she got home that evening, exhausted from cleaning all day. In Leonardo's mind, it seemed that no matter how hard she worked or how much she devoted herself to looking after her children, she just couldn't escape the curse of her mother. She knew that she needed more money to afford better medical care for her children. She needed a house outside of the city where illness spread so quickly. She needed enough money so that her children could grow up comfortably. And so Leonardo decided to do something that she would never have dreamt of before.
At work, Leonardo had no access to the bank's money, but she did have access to the bank's ledgers. And so one day she created a fake account and filled out an amount of money that she felt was reasonable to start off her nest egg. However, it didn't go unnoticed by the bank clerks, and the following day, when Leonardo arrived for her shift, the police were waiting for her. She was convicted, sentenced, and imprisoned for fraud in 1927, and made it abundantly clear in her confession that she had worked alone and her husband had no part in her crime. Despite being sentenced to a few years in jail, Leonardo ended up spending no longer than 18 months inside. The main thing that kept her going was the thought of her one surviving son, Giuseppe. When she was released, Giuseppe, Raphael, and Leonardo packed up their bags once more and moved out of town. But now, something about her husband was different. He was no longer the kind, understanding, compliant man he had once been. He now had a lot less patience for his wife's eccentricities. He had started to view her with a more critical eye, something that reminded Leonardo of her mother. Their relationship began to break down, and Leonardo blamed Raphael for not providing well enough for their family. And now she said that she had been forced to commit fraud because of him.
Meet Charlie. She loves dogs.
Guilty.
From Wookiees to Treatos, she powers her pup empire with Shopify.
The sales won't stop.
With Charlie's tech needs sorted, she can focus on turning her home business into a global operation. From in-store to social, connect with customers wherever and whenever, so they don't go barking up the wrong tree. Yes, boy. Join Shopify, the commerce platform powering millions of businesses worldwide. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up for a free 14-day trial at shopify.co.uk/try22. Go to shopify.co.uk/try22 to start selling online today.
Raphael did, however, get himself a job in Lacedonia, Avellino. So the family hopped on a train and headed for the small rural town. The job even came with a house on a hill overlooking a river, and the family found themselves actually happy here. And Leonarda once again got pregnant. But she still couldn't shake the fear that her mother's curse would doom this unborn child to another early death. Then, one day, a group of Romani travellers were passing through the town, and Leonarda couldn't resist taking the opportunity to have her fortune read again. Perhaps it might be different this time. The fortune teller read her palms and told her, quote, "In one hand I see prison, in the other hand I can see an insane asylum." Again, quite menacing. We don't know how she entered this tent and what she gave away as her first line, but not great.
I mean, neither of those are good things.
So a scared Leonarda paid the woman and went home. Within weeks, she had given birth to another healthy baby boy. But now, with again the words of that fortune teller ringing in her ears, instead of joy and hope, she viewed this new baby with suspicion. Why would the universe gift her a healthy baby now? She was certain something terrible was going to happen to him. And again, her anxiety grew and grew until she was having fits once more. Leonarda's behaviour also began to become more peculiar, and she seemed to be consumed by a feeling of doom. In the evenings when Raphael would return home, he often found that Leonarda had disappeared towards the outskirts of town where the Romani travellers would camp in the woods. Leonarda had become obsessed with them. She was visiting them almost every night, learning everything she could about magic and curses from the fortune tellers.
When July rolled around, the town was in full swing, preparing for the yearly summer festival, and Leonarda and many other locals began working hard getting things ready in the field. After they'd finished work, many of the families would sleep out under the stars on bundles of hay instead of going back to their muggy homes, which sounds like a mosquito nightmare. It was one such night on the 23rd of July, when at around midnight, all of the families sleeping in the field were awoken by the earth shaking. Literally. And immediately Leonarda thought that this was a sign of an evil spirit flying over her town. The sounds of people screaming echoed all around them in the darkness. And then again the earth shook, but even worse this time. The families camped out on the field watched as the entire town they called home began to crumble and fall. Buildings and houses were reduced to rubble within minutes. The 1930 Irpinea earthquake claimed 1,400 lives, with almost all casualties being in Avellino. Leonardo was convinced that she had caused this, or at least her mother's curse had. Leonarda and her family lost their home, livelihood, and all their possessions that night. And finally, any hopes that she had about beating her mother's curse were wiped away. By this point, Leonarda had 4 living children. 10 had died in childhood, and she had many more miscarriages. Giuseppe, 2 of her girls, and the youngest boy had all survived the earthquake, and together they were about to set off on an arduous journey across the country to the town of Correggio.
People took pity on the family, knowing that they were refugees from the terrible earthquake that had struck Naples, and the charity flowed in. Raphael easily found some clerical work, and they were even able to rent a small house that was connected to what used to be a general store. In a way, the devastating earthquake that had destroyed their previous lives in Avellino was somewhat cathartic for Leonarda. It showed her that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how hard she tried to be in control of her family's well-being, some things were simply out of her hands. So she eased up quite a bit with her children. And so, in their new life, the family managed to build up some savings. They had a good home, and for the first time, Leonarda allowed herself to hope and dream of a good future, even of letting go of her mother's curse. For the first time in her life, Leonarda made an effort socially. She even began writing poetry, which she would recite at dinner parties that she would attend with the other women of Correggio. That is lovely, and I'm glad for her because I do feel like she's getting better, but imagine how fucking annoying that would be if you just go to a dinner party and someone starts reciting their poetry. That's just one step worse than them pulling out the fucking guitar, isn't it?
Yes, I do think it is worse.
Other people in the town of Correggio didn't seem quite as annoyed as we may have been by Leonarda's antics, because pretty soon people would talk of Leonarda the poet and her lovely family and her well-behaved children. For the first time ever, nobody was looking at her with contempt or pity. Leonarda found herself with a lot of free time as well, and having never been one to sit around and do nothing, she decided that it would be a good idea to make use of the empty storefront connected to her house. And it didn't take Leonarda long to decide that soap would be the product that she'd sell. After all, she'd already learned how to make it in her previous job cleaning the bank. I'm really interested in maybe starting to learn how to make soap. It looks quite fun.
My sister has recently started to make candles, and she really likes doing that. So Leonarda stored all of the oils and perfumes she needed to get started on her soap mission, and within weeks she had made her first batch. Word spread quickly across all of Italy, and business began booming. Pretty soon, Leonarda found that she was making enough money to support her entire family, all by herself. Despite this, Leonarda still made time to socialise with the women of the town, and would often invite them over to her store for tea and cakes. And after Leonarda revealed her interest and training in fortune-telling, she began attracting a whole new set of clientele. After a number of Leonarda's predictions came true, word of the fortune-telling soap maker from Correggio spread around. And soon enough, people of influence from all over would come to Leonarda. When the farmers wanted to know which crops to plant that year, they'd ask her. Women would ask her who to marry, and pretty soon Leonarda became the advisor to almost every adult in Correggio. Whenever the Romani travellers passed through, Leonarda would trade soaps with them for books on the occult, bones, runes, tarot cards, and other spiritualist paraphernalia. She began spending evenings poring through these books, trying to find ways to curb her mother's curse, that despite her now happy life, she still believed haunted her. When your mum talks about the evil eye, she says it's because people are jealous, isn't she?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe quite a common thing, but the whole evil eye thing, as far as like my culture, I guess, has told me is that it's like if somebody sort of covets something from you, or like, you know, they sort of praise you, but that praise stems from a place of jealousy and then it jinxes you with the evil eye.
So essentially, at this stage in her life, Leonarda is that meme that's like, things are going a little too well.
Precisely.
She's waiting for something to happen.
And she's like, to cure that, I'm going to get really heavily into the occult because that just makes sense. That makes so much sense.
I mean, that's what I've done, and I would recommend it, honestly.
This is what I'm saying. And I just don't know if I've got the energy for it. So I think the closest I'll get to the occult is maybe starting to make some candles or some soap.
Okay.
Sounds good, though. But soon Leonarda's reading strayed into darker areas of the occult and moved away from just the sort of traditional healing spells that she had originally been looking at. She began studying folk magic books, known as Serguria, from the old witch cults, which existed in Italy before the rise of Christianity. Having made friends through the Romani travellers with other magic practitioners across Italy, Leonarda also started to get exposure to those who practiced Benedicaria, a Tuscan folk magic where they'd worship gods going back to the Roman Empire, and also to some who practiced the darker Stregonaria, which was witchcraft with roots in southern Italy, and a magic that was meant to bring harm and illness. And if you want to know more about witchcraft and the occult and all that kind of creepy shit, you should definitely head on over and listen to our bonus full-length episode that we released on Patreon this month. It is on the case of Anatoly Moskvin, the Russian guy who basically mummified all those dead girls that he dug up and turned them into little dolls and put little clocks and stuff inside their rib cages. It's some of the weirdest shit we've ever talked about on this show. And it's up now for all $10 and up patrons. Go listen to it.
It's one of those ones where, like, a lot of the time we'll come across cases, especially reasonably famous ones, and once you strip away all the myths and legends, it's not actually that interesting. This one is the opposite of that. It's even worse than you think it is.
Absolutely. So yeah, go check that out at patreon.com/redhanded. And again, guys, We hopefully by this point have released a little video that will show you how to use your RSS feeds effectively. You don't have to listen on the Patreon website or the app. You can just listen on your normal podcast player. Anyway, I'm off track. Back to Leonarda. So Leonarda, after hearing about all this occult, being exposed to all these people doing these various wonderful things, she decided that she wanted to become a fattucchiere, or a fixer, with the ability to heal those around her, and more so, of course, so that she could break her mother's curse. Leonarda's studies became darker and darker as she learned of potion making and casting spells, and although these things likely didn't make much difference in the real world, they did wonders for Leonarda's psychological state. And soon people began seeking out Leonarda for those newfound skills she had. If a young girl got pregnant out of wedlock, she'd come to see Leonarda for a potion that would remove the baby. If a man couldn't get it up anymore, she had a potion for that too. She'd cast spells of luck and fortune, but she became most well known for her protection spells.
Life was great and comfortable. All Leonarda had to do was keep making soap, and money kept rolling in. Her family were healthy and happy, and she was free to indulge all of her spooky bitch interests. But in 1939, a decade after Leonarda arrived in Correggio, pesky little World War II broke out. Mussolini had been rising to power since 1922, and in 1939, Italy allied with Germany as part of the Axis powers, or the Axis of Evil, if you are British. All of his life, Leonardo's son Giuseppe had been longing for a way to escape his mother's overbearing ways without hurting her feelings. He loved her dearly, but he knew he would never be truly able to come into his own if he remained within her grasp. Joining the army would be the perfect opportunity. Leonardo would have no choice but to be proud of him for defending the country. And so, Giuseppe signed up to fight for the fascists, but he was terrified of how his mother would react. By this stage in the game, most people in the entire town wouldn't even make the tiniest of decisions without first consulting Leonarda. And now here was her very own son enrolling to go off to war without so much as mentioning it to her first. Leonarda only learned of her son's plans when she was out shopping one day and someone congratulated her on Giuseppe's brave decision. That would piss you off, wouldn't it? You had to find out from someone else. Whew!
That is the worst. Though I'm surprised by this point there wasn't just mass conscription anyway, and like all the males had to go off and fight.
39 still pretty early days, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
So when Leonarda received this information at the market, she remained composed, but when she got home, she collapsed onto the floor crying.
Her son, her Giuseppe, he was no soldier. He had never even won a single fistfight in his entire life. He would surely not survive the war. And, of course, those would be possibly the rational concerns of any mother in her position. But Leonarda didn't live in a rational world. Her world was a much darker place, and it was dictated by superstition and magic. Leonarda didn't believe in coincidences or bad decisions. She only believed in her powers against the curse. A curse so powerful that as far as Leonarda was concerned, it had once leveled an entire town because of her. At this point, Leonarda realized that every event in her life had been leading her up to this exact moment. It was fate, and she knew then what had to be done. Leonarda ran to her study and began searching through her vast collection of occult books for the right protection spell, the right magic to ward off death and help her son survive the war. She found that all of the texts she read on death magic rituals agreed only on one point. It was the law of equivalent exchange. To get something, you have to give something of equal value. So to save a life, you have to give a life. So Leonarda knew that she would have to sacrifice someone. She would have to murder someone to save Giuseppe. It was simultaneously the easiest and the most difficult decision that she had ever had to make. On one hand, her sole purpose in life was to protect her children by any means necessary. On the other hand, however, Leonarda had never considered hurting somebody in real life. She'd suffered so much that she'd never dream of causing somebody else the same pain. But she concluded that this is what fate had decided for her.
There were two imperatives for Leonarda. Firstly, the killing must be painless, and secondly, she couldn't get caught. So she had to make a meticulous plan. Killing somebody painlessly would be easy. She had a plethora of herbs she could think of to fulfill this mission. But as for the second part, she decided the only way to ensure that she had full control of the situation was if the sacrifice died in her own home. It upset Leonardo to think of polluting her home like that, but she knew it was the only way to ensure the ritual would go undisturbed. Leonardo felt like this might be her final stand against her mother's curse that had plagued her and her family all of these years. This could be how she ended it once and for all. She decided the medium she would use to protect her son would be soap, of course, and food. This way, Leonardo could ensure Giuseppe was protected both inside and out, quite literally. It makes total sense. It had been her fate. She had learned to cook and make soap for this exact reason. She just didn't know. To attempt to understand Leonardo's way of thinking, let's have a quick peruse into the concept of narcissism and magical thinking and what happens when they happen at the same time. Leonardo completely believed that everything that happened around her was supernaturally influenced by her thoughts and actions. If something good happened, it was because she had successfully countered the curse set upon her. If things were going badly, it was because of supernatural forces that were targeting her. She was the main character in every aspect of reality, and everybody else in the world was just an extra to her. Other people's lives, hopes, and dreams weren't important in the slightest. Everyone's guilty of that to a certain extent, I think. Personally, when I want to feel like the main character, I go for a run at nighttime and run in the middle of the road.
But no, you're right. I think that with things like narcissism or psychopathy or even magical thinking, all of these things exist on a sort of sliding scale, on a spectrum. Nobody is just like, you're a narcissist or you're not, or you're a psychopath or you're not. It's like on a scale, on a spectrum. And I think that Leonardo just exists very highly up that scale, given the fact that she watched an earthquake destroy an entire town and kill 1,400 people, and she thought it was because of her mother's curse.
That way of thinking justified whatever Leonardo felt she needed to do. It didn't matter which silly little human laws she was breaking because she was serving this higher power, which was ultimately herself in a weird, twisted way.
So Leonardo got everything in place. She knew how she would carry out her ritual and how she would protect Giuseppe. All that remained now was the most crucial piece of the witchy puzzle. She had to commit a murder and get away with it. Leonardo had appointments scheduled daily with the women of the town, and the ones who visited her the most were often the most vulnerable and alone, the perfect murder victims. Most women came to her for help in finding love. She was actually responsible for many of the recent marriages in the area. But one of the women stood out to Leonardo as maybe the most vulnerable and the most alone, a woman named Faustina Setti. Faustina had never been able to find a husband, and she'd been single throughout her 20s, 30s, and now halfway into her 40s. She felt that she was doomed to be single forever. Faustina had been coming to Leonardo for a year now, begging her to find her a suitable husband. But no matter how many love rituals and luck charms Leonardo gave her, she could never find a suitor to marry. And so Leonardo deduced this was fate. She was not meant to marry. Faustina's purpose lay elsewhere, and her life was to serve a higher purpose. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about the, narcissistic, magical thinking, because she's like, oh, Faustina, she's not able to find what she needs, but it's because she needs to serve a higher purpose, but that higher purpose is for me, not for herself. Also, the other handy little thing here was that Faustina was a virgin, and this meant in Leonardo's eyes that her soul was pure, and so she was the perfect sacrifice to provide Giuseppe protection. When Faustina arrived for her appointment that day, Leonardo immediately grabbed her by the hand and told her, "I found you a husband." Faustina's eyes lit up with excitement. "Who is it?" she asked.
Leonardo told her that her suitor was a man in Pula. This suitor had seen a picture of Faustina and fallen in love with her. Leonardo said that she'd been exchanging love letters with the man on Faustina's behalf and was just finishing up arranging the wedding, which is to take place in Pula. All Faustina needed to do was pay for her safe passage there, which she did with her entire life savings, and then write letters to all of her friends and family, as though she were already halfway to Pula. Leonardo told Faustina to explain in these letters that she was going to finally be married and begin a life that she'd always wanted, and that she was happy and safe. Leonardo said that she would stamp and post the letters over the coming weeks. All Faustina needed to do was come back the following morning with her travel bag and the written letters. An ecstatic Faustina arrived around dawn the next day, and Leonardo had got all of her own family out of the house before she turned up. Faustina was so excited and full of nerves that she'd barely noticed Leonardo's erratic behaviour when she stepped into the house. Leonardo led Faustina to the dining room table and sat her down and told her to relax. Then Leonardo poured Faustina a very large glass of red wine, telling her it would calm her nerves. Even though it was very early in the day, Faustina took a large swig. All the while, Leonardo was sat across the table from her, smiling, with their gaze fixed on her. "Go on, drink up, it'll help," she said. And so Faustina downed the rest of the glass of the bitter herbal-tasting wine, and even the sediment, which had collected at the bottom, slipped down her throat. Leonardo didn't say a word. She just kept staring at her with a steely gaze.
Soon the room began to darken for Faustina. Her movements became sluggish and weak. She tried to speak, but her mouth was no longer cooperating with her brain. She felt as though she had drunk 3 bottles of wine, not just a glass. She looked up across the table and realized that Leonardo was no longer sat there. Her head tipped back as she completely lost control of her muscles. And that's when Faustina saw Leonardo walking back into the room, this time with a large axe in her hand. Why does she have an axe? Faustina wondered. Leonardo was slowly walking towards her, never breaking eye contact, and chanting something foreign under her breath. No matter how hard she tried, Faustina couldn't move or get a word out. As Leonardo closed the distance between them, axe in hand, Faustina tried desperately to wipe the sweat from her eyes, which was now pouring down her forehead. She was frozen in place when she realized what was happening as she watched Leonardo lift the large axe above her head. Leonardo whispered, "Sorry," and in one fell swoop, she brought the large axe down onto Faustina's head. But the axe was too heavy for Leonardo, and she missed her target. Instead, horrifically, she lodged the axe into Faustina's shoulder. Faustina let out a scream as blood poured from her wound all over the both of them.
"If you haven't stopped eating, do it now." Leonardo's eyes met with Faustina's, which were pouring with tears and wide with terror and agony. Unflinchingly, Leonardo pulled the axe from her friend's shoulder and lifted it above her head again. This time, she swung it down onto the centre of Faustina's head, but the axe slipped on contact with her skin and sliced off a chunk of her scalp and half of her face. The gory mess was almost too much for Leonardo to bear, so much for a painless death, but she reminded herself why she was doing this. She had to protect Giuseppe by any means necessary. Faustina was still alive and letting out a high-pitched whine, even with half of her face hanging off by a few slivers of skin and cheek flesh. The precious blood Leonardo was meant to collect for the potion was pooling around their feet. And so Leonardo this time held nothing back. She swung the axe onto Faustina's head again and again and again. Chunks of bone and meat fell onto the floor with every swing, until finally the high-pitched shriek ended. Faustina was finally dead. All Leonardo wanted to do was collapse onto the floor with exhaustion, but the job was not done yet. She'd come too far to turn back. Faustina's death couldn't be in vain, and Giuseppe had to be protected from the curse. The first thing she had to do was drain all the blood still in Faustina's body, so she hung up the body pieces on herb drying hooks, allowing the blood to pour into the basins beneath. Then Leonardo mopped up the blood on the kitchen floor, thinking what a waste it was.
Leonardo then began massaging the flesh on Faustina's hanging body parts to draw all of the blood out, but all that was left was barely half a basin's worth. She then poured the blood into trays, which she then placed into a searing hot oven that she'd spent all night preheating with a wood fire. In there, the blood would dry, and it would turn into a usable ingredient for her protection spell. Now the blood was slowly drying out. She butchered Faustina's body parts, which she placed in saucepans of caustic soda on the stove. The same mixture she would have used to render animal fats for use in her fine soaps. The caustic soda dissolved everything from Faustina's hair to her bones, and the fat floated to the top. With a shawl wrapped around her face to protect her from the nauseating fumes, Leonardo stirred the solution and scooped out the fat. She then began preparing the ingredients for tea cakes: flour, sugar, and eggs, before she removed the trays of blood from the oven, which had now dried into a thick, gooey matter with a solid brown crust. Leonardo scraped this into a large mixing bowl with her other ingredients, and just to ensure the taste of blood wouldn't be too noticeable, she threw in a splash of vanilla. Once the tea cakes were ready, Leonardo scrubbed away every speck of blood in the kitchen from the tables, the counters, the walls, and even the ceiling. She soaked her blood-crusted clothes in vinegar until finally there was absolutely no sign left of the terrible sin she had just committed. It was as though nothing had ever happened at all. Feeling calmer now, as everything around her began to look more normal again, and with the adrenaline that she had felt all day leaving her system, Leonardo lifted the lids of one of her pots on the stove to check its progress.
Horrified, she dropped it back down. It was filth. A thick, putrid, brown, disgusting pile of goo. It wasn't anywhere near what she needed to make soap with. It was corrupted. Never before, in all the time she had used animal fats, had the results been like this. She wouldn't have dared to make that into soap to use on her precious Giuseppe. A familiar feeling of utter failure washed over Leonardo. Faustina's sacrifice had been for nothing. Distraught, she poured the slime into buckets and emptied them into the septic tank. Big mistake. And she cried as she did it. Her tears were not for Faustina, they were for Giuseppe. This failure was going to cost him his life. Weeks went by as Leonardo fought with the trauma of what she'd done to Faustina, but never, not for a second, did she think about not going through with her plans. She had no choice but to find another sacrifice. So she continued her appointments with all of the troubled women in her town and sounded them out for who would be her next victim. And to find out who that was, you're going to have to tune in next week, because that, friends, foes, Romans, countrymen, is all we have time for on this particular edition of Red-Handed. So come and follow us on the Instagrams and Twitter. Go to Patreon and do that thing. And here are some people who have already done the Patreon thing. Let's get going. We've got Amy Margaret Litloff, Poppy W, Brittany Shields, Mackenzie Mahan, Eleanor May Crabtree, Lena, possibly, Ashley Hagelin, Candy Sloan, Shu, don't know, Stevie, Sarah Kirk, Nikki Hansen, Akira Farnocia Duncan, Claudia, Mary B. Hedgecoth, Kerry Frew, Colleen Begley, Aaron Silk, Ariel Mallory, Connor Bohan, Krista Rhodes, Rebecca Manley, Lindsay Stevens, Mike Smith, Ashlyn Roberts, Lauren Howard, Amber Ronzani, Martina Sokol, Montez Michael Bird, Manuel Hurtado, Sarah Rose, Dania Olsen, Sasha Proctor, Sarah Richards, Aoife Pugh, Brooklyn H, Laura Fiddler, Nick Mamatoli, Amy, Hannah Kelly, Valencia, Stephanie G, Lisa Brown, Julia X, Charlotte Gonzalez, Aisling Alsop, Rebecca Garcia.
Oh, and look, I tagged in on Harold Shipman. Is that you, or is this another Mike Clitoris setup? I'm not having it, guys. I am also very sorry if your name is actually just Harold Shipman.
Yeah, I know. Also, stop asking us to do Harold Shipman. We'll never do it. It's boring.
Guys, we're never going to fucking cover Harold Shipman. He's the most boring man in the world. Anyway, Ashley Rist, Jackie H, The Witch, Zoe Maria Lowry, Caroline Easter, Charlotte Rispindirelli, Leah Brown, Lucy Jones, Suzanne Burns, Michelle Ward, Laura Dalzell, Jennifer, Christopher Boyer, Nicole Baker, Georgina Middleton, Cassie Campbell, Daisy Bannister, Bria Kaufman, Paige Warmington, Tiarni Sweeney, Jenny Koklanko, Cheryl Morgan, Sophie Campbell, Sydney, Lauren Taylor, Sophie Miller, Carson Hoskinson, Becky Berry, Jasmine Deal, Laura McKay, Morgan McCallum, Brandy Birch, Samantha Vega, Alma Ruiz, Samantha McGeehan, Joshua Dunlop, Katie Brunton, Laura Zabrowski, Leilani M. Nat, Poppy Yules, Dory Barber, Faye B., Sarah Green, Liz O'Neill, Claire Sanderson, Aono, Sarah Lehenian, Rach, Alicia McGill, Lucy Hannah, Jessica Thompson, Sarah Kelly, Ashley Tuckwood, Stella, Brooke Bolezi, Danny, Hannah Lewis,
Holly Ann Holland, Alison O'Brien, Rachel McDougall, Chrissy Mackey, Rebecca Solomon, Nicole Baldelli, Carly Brewski, Erica, Rebecca Lynn, Veronica Sina, Ashley Mobley, Heidi Mertens, AC Thompson, Hannah, Laura Gawley, Holly McDonald, Kelly Probst, Carla Avlia, Jessica, Karen Tatt. Oh no.
Oh no.
Guys, I don't even know what that punctuation mark is called. It's like a little arrow. Morse Privet, Lisa O'Sullivan, Brandy Kinyon, Hannah Ettridge, Jasmine Smith, Carrie Miller, Lauren Monk, Jordana Baljakas, Catherine Kristen, Kirsten P, Hannah Sloan, Jamie Bugay, and Snidis Valsdotter. Thank you very much for supporting the show and for all of your wonderful names. Maybe it's good for our brains processing strange words all the time.
Possibly. That's a good point. I do feel very mentally and physically exhausted now. I'm still standing. That's probably something to do with it.
Hashtag stalls for Sarutis. All of this Patreon.
Never.
All of this Patreon support.
But no, thank you guys seriously so much for your support on Patreon. We just fucking love doing what we're doing and there's no way we could do it if you didn't support the show. So thank you. And we will be filling your ears with lots of delicious Patreon content over the coming month and more so as well on the main feed. So we'll see you later. Goodbye.
Bye.